Thanks, Rob and Russ. Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm very excited to be coming to Stanford exactly because of the kinds of events like this that you've organized and the privilege to be able to share the discussion with Abby and Lisa. And I'm very much looking forward also to all the participants and the questions and comments people may have. As you noted, we're in the midst of a unprecedented tragedy, both in health and the economy. And we've heard some of the effects of that already. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what might come after that. Economists have a term called hysteresis, which basically means that sometimes when you change things, they don't go back to the way they were before, even when the conditions return. And I think that's going to be very much the case with this crisis. People like us are learning about the power of remote work. Companies are aggressively trying to figure out how to automate some of their operations, how to use machine learning and other technologies to have people have the workplace continue to function with fewer human workers. And some of those changes, I think, are going to be permanent and lasting. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Let me share my slides here and show you what I have in mind. So I'll talk in particular about those two topics that I just mentioned, how COVID's affecting AI, machine learning, and also remote work. And let me start with a quote that I came across from a revolutionary about a century ago. He said that there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And I think these past few weeks are example of those kinds of time periods. There's been just a huge acceleration in obviously remote work and also machine learning, and over the weekend, maybe some social change as well. To zoom in first on some of what's happened with technology, we've seen a huge increase in the adoption of different technologies. Lisa touched on this a little bit as well, as how these crises can accelerate technology adoption. One example is TensorFlow, the tool that is Google developed for doing machine learning, has become dramatically more popular. 10 million downloads just in the past month. And a little later, I'll show you some of the work that we've been doing using that exact tool. But at the same time, machine learning is very far from artificial general intelligence. It can't do everything. There are just some things that it does very well and some things not so well. So a natural question is, what parts of the economy are going to be most affected by the adoption of these technologies, about machine learning in particular, and which parts will be relatively less affected? And working with Tom Mitchell, Daniel Rock, and others, we've written a series of papers to try to identify the set of tasks that are most suitable for machine learning, and you can read more detail about them in the papers. But let me briefly say that what we've done is we've applied this rubric to 950 occupations, or 18,000 occupation-specific tasks, to understand which ones are more suitable and which ones are less suitable. And there's some patterns that emerge. For instance, we can see that if you look at all the occupations and you array them on the horizontal axis here by what the average wage is in that occupation, from the lowest paid ones on the left to the higher paid ones on the right, you see a pattern where the more machine learning applications are available in the lower paid jobs on average, and less so on the higher paid jobs. So for instance, most of us have probably experienced the automated cashiers that can recognize a cucumber or a banana or a tomato much better than they could have a few years ago, and beginning to automate parts of that process. But there's some high paid jobs like airline pilot that are also being increasingly affected by these technologies. No occupation is immune. Even economists are on the list there, although a little less subject than some of the other occupations, according to the analysis. You can also group it by industry, and you see that, again, some industries are much more affected than others. Education services, not as much, but manufacturing, retailing, transportation, especially accommodation and food services, have a lot of tasks that are suitable for machine learning. Different areas of the country are going to be affected very differently. The kinds of work that people do in Wyoming are very different than what they do in Manhattan or Miami. And we see that shows up in our analysis as well, that the likelihood that a machine learning system can affect some of those tasks is higher in some parts of the country than other parts of the country. So we'll have some disparate impacts. And then we can zoom in on individual companies. We can use the same tool to look at the tasks that are done in individual companies. And here's one bank that we looked at in some depth. And they have a lot of occupations that are affected by machine learning. The ones near the bottom there, like teller, executive assistant, and personal banker, have a large percentage of their tasks that are suitable for machine learning. The red bar is pretty large. And that means that these activities are likely to change quite a bit over the coming years, even more recently as companies are adopting these technologies. And our tool also gives them a way to have a path for what to do next. One option, for instance, for personal bankers is to reinvent the job so that it has more of the skills that aren't subject to machine learning, like leadership, product development, customer relations, and less of the tasks that are highly related to machine learning, like credit authorization. So it'd still be a personal banker, but they do very different work. Another option is to find new roles. Some of these personal bankers have a lot of skill overlap with business analysts or mortgage loan officers or HR managers, and we can map how similar they are to some of these other nearby occupations. And with a little bit of training, they're in a position to be much less vulnerable to the machine learning revolution. Let me also say a few words about remote work. We just finished 2 papers. Here's one of them, looking at the US data on how COVID is affecting remote work and work from home. We looked at about 25,000 individuals and had them answer 2 waves of surveys. And what we found was that about half of Americans are now working from home. It's an enormous transition. Before COVID, about 1/6 were working at home, and another third switched to working at home. So that's a big percentage of the workforce. I'm one of those people, and I'm sure many of you are as well. After the pandemic, many of them will go back to working the way they were before, but many others are going to continue to work from home. I talked to one CEO, and he polled his workforce, and they were mostly pretty happy with working at home. And he was very happy with the results and the productivity. So he is in the process of renegotiating his leases and plans on having people
1 minute.
1 to 2 days per week going forward, and the rest of the time working at home. And when they do come in, they'll focus much more on interactive activities rather than working in separate offices and cubicles. And I think that's part of this hysteresis I mentioned earlier, a transition that won't lead to us going back to the old ways afterwards. There are, as you might expect, big differences across states. The states in the Northeast that were hit hardest by COVID are also the ones that had the biggest switch to working at home. But we also found that one of the good predictors was the share of management and information work activities. Those types of tasks are much easier to do working at home. And finally, Lisa mentioned this data set from Burning Glass Technologies. It has over 200 million online job postings. We were analyzing it last night using TensorFlow, and we had some new results just in time for this. By looking at it, we could see which kinds of tasks and jobs are most suitable for machine learning. Most suitable for remote work. So similar to the other one, but now focusing on remote work instead. And you see that jobs like ours in education tend to be more remotable, anything involving management, whereas people doing installation and physical work are less remotable. So let me just summarize by saying that these powerful technologies are already available, whether in machine learning or remote work. They haven't been put to use as much because it takes time for businesses to adapt. But with this shock to the system, companies and individuals are being forced to adapt and learning when they work and when they don't work so well. But thinking ahead, after the pandemic, we're going to have a new economy that has a lot more people doing remote work, a lot more people working offshore as well, and also a lot more people using machine learning in their work. And that's going to be a very different kind of economy. And it makes sense for managers today to think about what kind of skills and workforce they want for that economy of the future. So let me stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.